Horses love to eat and they're really big animals, so sometimes we don't think twice about how much they're eating. But in reality, overfeeding your horse can cause serious health risks. So here are 4 signs that you may be overfeeding your horse. One of the first ways you're going to tell that maybe you're overfeeding your horse is that the horse will just look a bit overweight. So every horse is different. Horses have different body types just like humans. So sometimes you may have a more overweight horse, even though the horse isn't eating a lot. And then sometimes you're going to have a horse that is really thin and has a hard time keeping its weight on, even though that horse may be eating a ton. So every horse is different, but for the main part, we want our horses to look healthy, and that's a great indicator that the horse is getting what it needs. So the way to do this is a body scoring chart. So vets use a score where they score your horse 1 to 9. So 1 being like the horse is skin and bones, kind of a little skeletal, and then 9 being the horse is obese. And so within this range, the perfect weight for your horse is a 5. So if you can get your horse looking like a 5, that is the best thing for your horse. So we'll show some pictures up on the screen of the different scores and kind of what each score looks like. I don't have a picture for the 1 because I feel like that's kind of graphic. It would be a horse that is severely thin, that looks like a skeleton. So we'll show you the rest so you can kind of start gauging where your horse is at. So if you would score your horse above a 5 on the score chart, that means your horse is probably overweight, maybe getting more to eat than it needs. Some other signs that your horse is overweight, because sometimes it can be difficult looking at the chart and kind of determining for yourself. But if your horse just looks round, like round in the belly, round in the rump, that's a great indicator. If your horse is really round in the rump, they're probably getting too much to eat or too much sugar. Round through their neck. A round horse is usually an overweight horse. Another indicator are fat pockets on your horse, and if you haven't seen them before, this may also be hard to spot, but usually they are going to be on the horse's neck, like on the crest of the neck, and also around the horse's shoulders and barrel. You're gonna see these fat pockets or just parts that look really squishy. What our aim is for that number 5 on the score chart is when we're looking at our horses, kind of standing back, we do not see the horse's ribs. But when we run fingers over the horse's barrel, we can feel the ribs. So that is the ideal body condition and what we're aiming for. I'm gonna say the best way to know if you're overfeeding your horse is to look at your horse's body weight. And the reason this is important is because horses are supposed to get about 2% of their body weight a day in feed. And the majority of this is gonna come from like forage, which is grass or hay. So that means if you have a 1,000-pound horse, that horse needs to be eating about 20 pounds of food a day. So there's actually an equation we can do to figure out or get a close estimate about how much your horse weighs, and then you can figure out how much you need to be feeding them. Since they don't make ginormous scales for horses, or you may have to go to the vet to get your horse weighed, I'm gonna pull up the equation here. You're gonna use this equation to first figure out your horse's weight. So your horse's weight equals their girth width squared times their length divided by 330. The girth width, that's really hard to say, is just where you would put your saddle on the horse and tighten the girth. So you're just gonna wrap a string around the whole horse right there, like right where their girth would go and around their back, kind of right behind their withers. And that is gonna give you the girth width. We will say that Tucker is probably about 80 inches around that girth. So he's about 80 inches around, and then we have to square that times length. So real quick, let's figure out his length. So for your horse's length, you measure from the point of their shoulder to the point of their rump, and that is kind of like the longest part of your horse. And so Tucker would be about 50 inches. So we determined that his girth is about 80. So we need to square 80. 80 times 80, 6,400. Then we need to multiply that by 50 inches. All right, that gives us 320,000. Divide that by 330, and this is saying he's about 969 pounds. So now that we know that Tucker's about 969 pounds, and remember, this is a rough estimate, but it's gonna get you close. Now that we know that, now we know we need to feed him 2% of his body weight. So we are going to multiply 969 by 0.02. I feel like I'm back in math class. If these numbers were correct, I haven't actually measured him, I just gave you rough numbers so we could do this equation together. If these numbers are correct, 2% of his body weight is 19.4 pounds a day. So that means I would be needing to feed him 19.4 pounds a day. So in order to figure out how much your horse needs to eat, you need to know their weight, and then of course you need to weigh their food to get that perfect measurement. And what I would recommend for this is actually a suitcase weigher. So with the suitcase weigher, I'll put a picture on the screen so you can see what it looks like. It's like you hook it onto the suitcase and you can like pull it up and it tells you how much it weighs, and it's a tiny tool so you don't need to get a giant scale. But this is easy because you can hang like hay nets on it or like a grain bucket and you could get the weight that way. So this method is much easier to do if you are monitoring your horse's feed and they are more on hay than grass, because when your horse is out in grass pasture, it is much more difficult to measure how much they're getting a day. Now, if you do track how much your horse gets a day in terms of weight, and your horse is still looking thin, that can mean there's something else going on in terms of maybe they're sick with something and you need to talk to a vet. It also may mean that they just need something else in their diet and they're missing something. So for example, a lot of young horses have a hard time keeping weight on them just because they're growing like crazy. So they may need to be fed like alfalfa over just grass hay, because alfalfa has much more protein that it will help them keep the weight, and it'll give them more energy because they're young and they need that energy to grow. So it's important to know things like that. Just because you're feeding your horse the right weight, they may not look right, they may not be the right healthy weight. So you just may need to move things around in that way. You may be overfeeding your horse if your horse is experiencing hoof or joint problems. So an overweight horse is just like an overweight human, an overweight dog. They're going to experience more trauma in their joints and in their feet just because of the extra weight. So it can affect them in a number of ways. I remember when I was young, we had a really fat pony at the stable, and he had a knee problem that his knee would swell up and he would sometimes be a little off. And it was probably because of his weight, because he was super fat. Even if your horse isn't fat, but they're being overfed, it can still affect their feet. And that comes down to the sugar your horse is eating. Horses do not digest and take in sugar like humans do. I mean, sugar isn't really good for anyone, but for horses especially, it is very detrimental to their health. The tissues in a horse's hooves are sensitive to sugar. And so if a lot of excessive sugar gets down in the tissues of the hoof, it can cause those tissues to become inflamed. And this leads to laminitis. And if this continues and it's not treated and the horse isn't put on a diet, those tissues can become so inflamed that they are compromised, and then they start to fail, and then the bone within the hoof starts to move and drop or twist, and it's very painful for the horse. Sometimes the horse may have to be put down because of that. So it is very important for us to make sure we are aware of any hoof problems our horses may be having. Some horses are just different than others. Some horses, they just go through life, their feet are fine. Other horses have more tender and sensitive feet, and that means they can have more of a response to sugar in their system. So if you have a horse that has hoof problems, the first thing I would think if I saw my horse come up with hoof problems is like, what does their weight look like? What am I feeding them? What are they eating? Are they getting a lot of sugar? Because sometimes your horse may not be overweight, but they can still experience laminitis because it's just a sugar thing. It's not necessarily a weight thing. So that's important to keep in mind. If your horse is struggling with joints and with their feet, always think first about how much sugar they're getting or if you're overfeeding them. That brings me to my next point. Sometimes we may not think we're overfeeding our horses and they may be getting the right amount of pounds per food, but the problem comes down to we are overfeeding certain substances like sugar. Unfortunately, there are many things our horses can eat that have excessive sugar in them, like lush pasture grass. It's pretty amazing when you research the grass in America and that our horses are on in America, it is not the natural original grass that was here, and it is all very high in sugar. So, the horses in the wild are eating shrubs and grass they find out there, which is low in sugar, and that is what horses need. But in modern times, our horses are put on pastures that have very high sugar. So we need to make sure we're not overfeeding on sugar from the grass. So what this looks like is, if your horse is out in a pasture, that's fine, watch their weight. But you also may need to be very diligent with them and monitoring how much they're eating. If they are gaining weight, you may need to put a grazing muzzle on them to keep them from overeating on the grass. You may also need to take them off the grass at certain points of the day and, just put them on a dry lot or in a stall and give them like hay or feed that's not high in sugar. Another point of this is most grains are very high in sugar. So you want to be very careful when you feed grain to your horse. You first want to look at the recommended amount of feed. And usually you can look on like the feed bag and it will say if your horse weighs this much, give them this much grain. I've seen people who they give their horse way more grain than that is listed on that chart. But it also comes down to, there are grains out there that can help your horse, if they need protein or they need extra nutrients or things like that, that don't have a lot of sugar. So you just need to be cognizant of that and look into that. Another thing we may overfeed on is protein. So if you just feed your horse like alfalfa hay and high protein grain, your horse is going to have an excessive amount of protein, which is going to potentially make them overweight. So you just need to look on that as well, because protein, even though it is good for you, it can have negative effects if you have too much of it. Now, all that to say, feeding your horse does not have to be like a scary experience, and you don't have to be worried per se, but it is important that you are educated so you can do right by your horse. I have an online course that walks you through basic horse care for your horse, like if you're just getting into horses or you just got your first horse. It basically walks you through everything you need to know, not only from how to feed your horse, but then just every care aspect you need. Because when you first get into horses, it is so much information and everyone wants to tell you their opinion. And so I just tried to simplify it for you so you could get information that will help you, but it's not overwhelming. So the link to that course is in the description. It's the Horse Care Keys to Success course.